Welcome everyone to my channel. I am Ben. Today, we step into a chilling case of ruthless violence at a coal mine. An explosion that shattered the dawn and left bodies buried under dust and fire. But within this chaos, there was a mysterious ride that seemed ordinary, yet would later alter the entire direction of the story. What truly happened on that fateful morning? Southwestern China carried a quiet that morning, the kind of mountain stillness you only notice when it is broken. Luoxi County in Honghe City, Yunnan province, sat folded into green ridges and narrow roads, a coal country where black dust clung to boots and lungs, and the town of Huqing lived by the rhythm of shifts. At about 9:10 in the morning on November 18th, 2010, that rhythm tore apart. Mr. Gao had worked the Xiaotongdi coal mine for years, a man who knew the weight of a shovel, the wet smell of the shaft, the way air grew heavy before rain. He was on routine duty when a single concussion cracked the world open, one long rolling blast like a bomb. The ground bucked, metal screeched, dust leapt from every surface as if the mountain coughed. For a heartbeat, there was no sound but ringing. Then came the shouting. Dozens of workers burst from the mouth of Shaft 2, faces erased beneath coal and cement powder, hair and eyebrows turned gray by dust, boots half lost, belongings scattered. People fell to their knees, crawled, tried to run. In panic, everyone looked like everyone else, no name tags, just eyes wide with fear. Mr. Gao and others did what men in mines learned to do: grab, lift, carry. They heaved injured bodies onto the flatbeds of trucks and into the backs of vans, hands slipping on grit, breath burning. Someone sprinted for the office phone. Police and medics were called. When officers arrived, the scene was a map of violence. One body lay at the access path, another beneath a wall of fractured stone. Two more lay close to the mouth of Shaft 2, the place the blast seemed to come from. What looked at first like an underground explosion wasn't underground at all. Investigators traced shattered edges and singed tarpaulin to a crude hut, a storage lane to right beside the shaft. Normally used for cement bags and construction materials, the tarpaulin roof had been shredded to ribbons. A section of nearby power lines sagged where the shock wave had whipped it. The ground bore 4 blast scars, and there was one device that had failed a silent, unexploded charge amid debris. The dead nearest the lean had the signature of shockwave trauma organs ruined without an obvious wound. They sifted through ash and gravel and found pale nuggets of residue. Laboratory checks would later confirm it. Emulsion explosive, an industrial ammonium nitrate-based compound common in mining and tunneling. 2 lengths of insulated wire, one yellow, one red, snaked from the lean to a connection point on the mine's overhead power feed. Farther off, on a short retaining wall, a crude manual switch waited with its cover blown back, the toggle scorched. Someone had built a simple, brutal circuit: power, wire, charge, switch. Using these threads, officers began to stage the crime in their heads. The suspect or suspects had likely moved inside the lean-to, planted 5 devices, then slipped away to a hiding spot near the wall, where a concealed switch sat ready. Wait for a crowd, trigger the current, let chaos do the rest. But chaos had not acted alone. As emergency rooms filled and the dust settled, the tally hardened. 9 dead, dozens more injured. Autopsies drew a brutal dividing line. Only 2 had died from the blast itself. 7 were killed by bullets, 5 shot from behind as they fled, 2 shot from the front. That meant someone had used the explosion as cover for an ambush, firing into panicked workers when they were most exposed. So the investigators walked the perimeter again, eyes low, mind slow. That's when they found the small house, a single story, workmanlike structure not far from the blast. It was a cramped room, about 20 square meters. That is about 215 square feet. It's plastered dusty, its windows dull. In one wall, a fresh opening, A rough, chisel-scarred hole about 30 centimeters across. That is about 12 inches, just wide enough for a rifle muzzle and a sliver of sightline. On the floor below the hole lay 8 spent casings, all of the same small caliber family. The hole aimed at the very opening where the workers had choked and surged after the blast. It changed everything. The bomber hadn't only wanted to frighten or sabotage, the bomber had wanted bodies. The plan, now visible, felt chilling in its economy. Plant charges in the storage leaned to draw people into the open and drive them toward predictable paths, then moved to the little house chosen because the room sat slightly higher, a touch of elevation over the yard, with a narrow, defensible angle through the newly cut hole. From that slot, any movement near Shaft 2's mouth would pass through a shooting lane. No need for exquisite marksmanship if the lane is tight and the targets are funneling, just rhythm and timing. 8 shots loosed, 7 people struck. Forensics would later mark entry wounds that told the shooter's position like compass points. What soothed was the method. What screamed was the intent. This was not a mine accident, not a loose cable or a mishandled crate. This was a staged detonation followed by a deliberate killing, executed with tools one might find around any industrial site: wires, power, tarpaulin, a storage shed, and the one thing a mine should never see in anger: a rifle. Past the caution tape, the life of Hu King carried on in its strange, brittle way. Women waited outside a clinic. Foreman called roll. A boy pushed a bicycle with a chain that wouldn't catch. Cement dust still drifted off the ridge, mixing with morning fog until the air looked chalked over. Officers mapped trajectories with string. Photographers worked from knees. A detective ran gloved fingers along the raw edge of the hole in the wall, feeling heat-cured grit flake under the touch. He imagined the suspect pressing a shoulder to that wall, squinting through coal haze, thumb on a switch one moment, finger on a trigger the next. The first part of an answer was now on the ground. 4 blast points, 1 dud charge, emulsion explosive residue, red and yellow detonation wires feeding a manual switch, a firing position cut into a small room roughly 20 square meters in size, 8 casings on the floor, a tight line of fire toward the shaft. The second part, the face behind the plan, remained in shadow, but the pattern pointed toward someone who knew the mine's movements and choke points, someone who could wire a circuit from site power and select a room that offered both concealment and line of sight. Not a random passerby, not luck. By noon, the mountain quiet had crept back in, though it never truly returned. Word ran ahead of the police cars, took the stairs 2 at a time, and spread through Hu Cheng's alleys. 9 gone, 7 shot. It didn't make sense until it did, the way hard things suddenly snap into focus. Someone had used the fear of an explosion to herd men like livestock toward a slaughter lane. In a place built on risk, someone had added design. The investigation would widen from here: names, grudges, a mine boss with enemies, but in that first window of hours, all the story's weight rested on what the ground gave up. A plan drawn in wire and dust, and a hole in a wall that turned panic into prey. The first conclusion felt almost too tidy. 8 shots, 7 people dead, each hit cleanly in the back or the chest, each falling during the worst of the panic. Precision like that, investigators said at first, sounded like the work of a professional, someone used to a rifle's recoil and the narrow patience it demands. The mine's grief traveled fast, past the ridge lines and along the freight roads, until it reached Beijing newsrooms and provincial bulletins. 9 dead, 48 wounded, numbers that in any country flatten breath and squeeze silence out of a room. Because of the death toll, because the method involved both explosives and gunfire, Yunnan authorities assembled a special task force almost immediately. They gave it a short, hard name pulled from the calendar. 11/18, the date the blast went off, November 18th, 2010. The ministry in Beijing took an interest, and with that interest came more hands, more eyes, more pressure. Early in those hours, The task force, looking at a blast zone and at bullet wounds that tracked from different directions, leaned toward the simplest version of complexity. There must have been two attackers. One planted the charges. Another lay in wait with a rifle to catch the survivors as they rushed into open ground. Then the bodies began to find names. And the names led somewhere the mine's managers did not expect. Most of the dead and injured were not Xiaotongdi employees at all. They were outsiders' men who had arrived under the guidance of a figure known in Luoxi County by more than one title: entrepreneur, mine boss, debt collector, fixer. His name was Zheng Zunyun. If the victims were his, the riddle sharpened. Why had Zheng appeared at his rival's shaft that morning? What quarrel had spilled so far into violence that men were brought in by the busload? And who had expected whom? Police found their first living thread in a coal trader surnamed Liu. He did what men here do: drove the roads between pits, buying here, selling there, working the narrow margins. On the morning of the blast, he said, Zheng hailed him for a ride to Xiaotongdi, claiming he needed to find the boss to settle a matter. Liu had no reason to refuse. He was headed that way. A handful of Zheng's companions climbed in as well. In the rear view, Liu noticed a tail that did not resolve into a single car. It became a string, dozens of vehicles, more than 100 men by his guess, none of them wearing the dust or the stoop of Xiaotongdi's own crews. He did not ask questions. In mine country, a crowd can mean anything from a rushed repair to a pushy negotiation. At the gate, Zheng disembarked and shepherded his people toward the mouth of Shaft 2. Liu stayed where his business took him by the loading area, waiting for coal. Minutes later, a concussion rolled over the yard. The cement air turned white, and bodies were falling in a kind of terrible rhythm. In the blast haze, Liu said. Zheng ran toward him, face streaked with powder, voice clipped. The power line had blown, Zheng warned. People had been electrocuted. They should get out. The excuse sounded like urgent kindness. To detectives, it sounded like a cover one more misdirection in a story already thick with them. The question sharpened. Who exactly was Zheng, and who stood across from him on the other side of this feud? Registry checks and the county's never-quiet rumor mill gave the name's dimension. Zheng was himself a mine boss with holdings in and around Luoxi. The man on the other side, Xiaotongdi's principal, was Wang Jianfu, ambitious and stubborn, a man who had spent years pushing his pit from a single shaft to more. They had been circling one another for months, maybe years. Their dispute, the kind that starts as a line on a seam map and grows into something heavier and more personal. By the time this news reached the task force, both men had already done something unexpected. Wang had turned himself in across the county line in Mile, walking into a police station, rather than waiting to be seized. Zheng, scraped up and bruised, did the same the next day, self-treated, and then delivered like a storm system rolling into a port. All noise and pressure and trouble. The symmetry of their surrenders did not clear the picture. It fogged it. Guilty men do not always run. Innocent men do not always wait. Sometimes power prefers to arrive at the front desk, unannounced, confident that it can negotiate its way through whatever comes next. Investigators stepped back and widened the frame. The mine history read like a ledger that had been smudged and rewritten too many times. In May 2005, 5 years before the blast, Wang won a 30-year contract to manage and extract coal at Xiaotongdi through Shaft 1. Growth followed. More men were hired. New equipment arrived. Work crept toward Shaft 2. Somewhere beneath the topsoil and the posted placards, greed and geometry met. The seam ran close to a neighboring claim, the Yunnan mine. From the surface, the mine entrances kept to their assigned plots. Underground, the temptation to nibble sideways became irresistible. It is easy to break a rule you cannot see. By October 2010, the owner of the Yunnan was losing money. He sold the operating rights to Zheng. A quiet owner had become a loud one. If those underground crosscuts had been small embarrassments when the neighbor was passive, they became provocations when the neighbor was Zheng. In the villages and tea houses, Zheng's story traveled with adjectives. He had been a scrapper as a boy, a collector as a young man, a lender with sharp terms, a fixer who knew which doors to knock and how hard. He made enemies, but he collected favors. He was blunt. He was the type of man a county learns to step around. Pressure then did what pressure does. Under Zheng's glare and under the risk that inspectors might be mobilized, Wang yanked his quiet trespass back into the light. He pulled his equipment away from the disputed stretch on the Shaft 2 side and took dynamite to the illicit tunnel mouth, sealing it with a blast and a promise. No more entry by this route. No more hidden teeth biting into Yunan's seam. On paper, that looked like compliance. In practice, to men like Zheng, it looked like theater, especially if the count of coal already taken had never been settled, and if the repair deadline had the soft edges of a half-agreement. Zheng's calculation was plain to read in hindsight, and maybe even out loud at the time. If he let this pass without a reckoning, his first weeks as the new owner of Yunnan would smell like weakness. His crews would take advice from other mouths. His rivals would set their watches by his silence. In the unregulated parts of the coal belt, reputation is not a coat you wear. It is skin. Once torn, it never mends quite right. The 1118 task force pushed its inquiry along two rails: facts and psychology. The fact rail gave them a chain, illegal encroachment, a sale, a demand for restitution, a promise to repair, a missed or doubted deadline, a large convoy at dawn, and a blast. The psychology rail gave them a mode of landscape humiliation and the fear of it, the need to prove a point, the tit-for-tat logic of men who live inside small fiefdoms, where law is an infrequent guest. The mix felt combustible even without explosives, but two parts of the early story still galled the investigators. First, why had the shooter been so efficient? An amateur can hit by accident. He cannot be accurate by habit, especially through a small wall hole, over rail hardware, at moving targets who run in unpredictable arcs. Second, why had both Wang and Zheng chosen to come in on their own? Was it guilt seeking a bargain, or confidence seeking a stage? The task force carried both questions forward because every subsequent decision whom to arrest next, which trail to prioritize, what to say to the press depended on the answers. Witness Lu's account now did a double duty. It placed Zheng at the shaft before the blast, not merely as a bystander, but as a leader moving a crowd. It also captured Zheng's first instinct after the explosion: announce an electrical accident and urge flight. If Zheng were a victim, that reflex could be read as survival. If he were complicit, it could be read as shaping the narrative in real time, planting a cause that would send investigators down a false line for just long enough to buy someone else minutes to move. Meanwhile, Wang's absence from Luoxi at the moment of the blast was a fact that neither cleared him nor tied him in. Men with power do not need to be physically present to make things happen. They simply need to be believed when they ask others to act. Rumor and counter-rumor now washed through the county like mine water, breaching old shoring. Some swore Wang had grown paranoid in recent months, hiring toughs and buying protection. Others insisted Zheng had been recruiting men from districts beyond Luoxi, paying retainers and promising favors to anyone willing to show up when called. None of that would be allowed to stand in a case file as anything more than color. The task force needed hard proofs. They kept returning to the map, the disputed boundary underground, the path from the storage lane to the little house with the firing hole, the route a man could take to cover that distance in 2 to 3 minutes, which is roughly the time survivors reported between blast and gunfire. That timing mattered. It meant one person could plausibly have done both jobs: detonate and then shoot, if he knew the mine's angles and shortcuts. The early two-attacker theory began to wobble not because it was impossible, but because it was unnecessary. All of that belonged to the investigators' notebooks in those middle hours of the first day. Outside, Hu Cheng was counting its losses and calling cousins. Inside, the task force was counting seconds and drawing lines. In this kind of case, what looks like chaos is often choreography, someone else's order imposed on other people's fear. By nightfall, the story had strained into a rough shape. A feud over theft dressed up as boundary confusion. A sale that changed the equation. A demand for repayment met by a promise to repair. A convoy at dawn. A blast. A shooting lane. 9 dead. 48 injured. 2 powerful men presenting themselves at different police stations as if power and guilt were both administrative acts. The names were on paper now. Zheng Xunyun and Wang Jianfu. The missing name, the one that would link the circuit to the rifle, was still in the dark. But the rails were set, and they led away from myth towards something colder. A plan. In disputes that start underground, the first lines are drawn in darkness. Wang Jianfu believed he had already stepped back into the light. He told anyone who would listen that the poaching under Yunnan was a matter from before Zheng Xunyun took over the neighboring claim. Once ownership changed, he said, he stopped nibbling sideways and even blasted shut the illicit mouth he had used beneath shaft 2. That to Wang was knowing his place, a hand extended to finish the quarrel without blood or spectacle. To Zheng, it looked like theater performed after the audience had already left. Zheng did not let it go. He demanded a full accounting within 20 days. Tally all coal Wang had taken from Yunnan over the years of silent encroachment. Calculate the market value, add interest, and pay. Wang refused flatly. Whatever had happened underground, he argued, was between him and Yunnan's previous owner, and it had nothing to do with Zheng. On October 25, 2010, Zheng walked into the Luoxi County Land and Resources Bureau and filed a formal complaint against Wang and the Xiaotongdi operation. At the same time, Wang pulled his own levers, leaning on a local grandee of the coal trade, a man named Wang Yuanhua, to mediate. The mediator summoned both sides. The drawings were spread, the underground paths traced with thick pencils, and the mediator pointed to the seal that had been blown across the illegal tunnel. Since Wang had closed the trespass and claimed to have stopped since Zheng took over, the sensible course, the mediator said, was to drop it and reconcile. Zheng refused. He wanted restitution, not a handshake. The bureaucracy tried another tack. On October 26th and October 28th, county land and environmental offices convened follow-up meetings with both parties and the interested bureaus. Wang eventually agreed to compensate Zheng, but only as a verbal promise, nothing on paper, and agreed that repairs on Yunnan's damaged tunnel would be completed within 20 days. It was a promise made under heat, not conviction. In practice, Wang had no intention of repairing anything. Zheng sent men to check and to harass. Wang ducked them. Here the timeline pinches. One account says the deadline for repairs was October 18th, a date that makes little sense, falling before the late October meetings that supposedly set the 20-day clock. Another version, supported by the sequence of events, fixes the effective deadline near November 18th. The morning everything came apart. Either way, Zheng arrived with numbers, with men, and with a plan to test Wang's promises. The explosion and the gunfire answered him. Police work is often the art of refusing stories that fit too soon. At first, investigators kept 2 suspects in their heads, one bomber, one shooter. Wang was not at the mine that morning. He had left Luoxi County for Kaiyuan City on business, so physical presence could not be laid at his feet. That neither absolved him nor convicted him. Power never needs to be on site to be present. What mattered for the moment was the ground's testimony. In the workroom behind the arch at shaft 2, the wall showed a fresh escape hole. On the opposite wall, a narrow gap opened toward the back slope. Down at the watercourse, shoe prints men's standard tread were pressed into soft earth. The same soul pattern matched the prints at the house where the shots were fired. Only one set of prints, one path, one man. That new path closed the gap between theory and necessity. The sequence hardened. Detonate, move, shoot. From the storage lean to the little house, no more than a short sprint then, into a room roughly 20 square meters. That is about 215 square feet, where a rough hole of about 30 centimeters, that is about 12 inches, had been carved to create a firing slit. Survivors told a consistent slice of time. 2 to 3 minutes passed between the thunder of the blast and the first cracks of rifle fire. A single person who knew the terrain, its ladders, alleys, rail sidings, and shortcuts, could travel that distance in that window. The early two attackers' idea now looked like a luxury the evidence did not require. The little house also taught something about aim. Outside, mine hardware cluttered the view. A line of ore carts, what locals called gong cars, sat on fixed rails, with couplers and brake wheels jutting into the line of sight. From the hole in the wall, if you angled down toward the mouth of the shaft, you did not get a broad, cinematic panorama. You got lanes, 3 narrow corridors where moving bodies would pass if they fled the blast zone in predictable arcs. Within those lanes, a shooter did not need to sweep right or left. He only needed to hold steady and time his trigger to the rhythm of panic. That neatness of design, 8 shots, 7 kills, looked less like a sniper's perfection and more like cruel architecture. Build the funnel first, and the marksmanship takes care of itself. It also reframed the question of expertise. An early whisper labeled the shooter a professional. The room disagreed. The slit was crude, the vantage point improvised, the sightlines constrained. Across the county, long-range shooters practice on ridgelines, not inside a cinder block room with a 12-inch hole. The task force ran tests from the spot and replayed trajectories. It was possible to hit by patience and rhythm without being a trained assassin, especially if you knew exactly where your targets would be forced to run. And the prints, the wiring, the placement of charges, all of it felt like a local's hand. Someone who could tap sight power and not trip the wrong breaker. Someone who knew where cement dust would drift and where men would crowd after a blast. Someone who could move from the lean to the workroom to the house without second-guessing a turn. This was not a drifter. This was a person woven into the mine's daily stitching. Meanwhile, the human logic, the calculus of pride and debt, kept running alongside the evidence. Zheng could not afford to be seen as soft in his first weeks as the owner of Yunnan. Wang could not bear public humiliation or hard payment for coal he believed he had already paid for in a discount from the previous owner. Each man brought his own story to the table and demanded the other swallow it. The county tried mediation. Mediation failed. When the blast took the breath from Huqing and the bullets found backs and chests, the old stories shattered and new ones tried to take their place. At headquarters, the task force began to shape next steps out of what they had. A timing window that allowed one perpetrator, a firing lane designed by clutter and panic, a single set of prints stitching the blast site to the firing room, a feud over coal recast as a public test of power. 2 principals, Zheng and Wang, who both walked in rather than ran. That last symmetry mattered. Men who intend to negotiate outcomes sometimes prefer a front desk to a back door. If either had hired help, if either had armed crews, the crews would talk. Money longs to be counted. The task force turned its attention to the people who could both wire a circuit and move comfortably inside Xiaotongdi, electricians, powder men, and the staff who controlled storage for explosives and fuses. One puzzle piece remained on the table: the early administrative meetings. Bureaucrats had written dates and made calls. Medians were proposed. A 20-day repair pledge was spoken aloud and nodded at. In small counties, such words often travel farther than the forms they fail to become. If Wang had no intention of repairing the damage, then Zheng's raid at dawn was not merely a test. It was a performance for an audience of foremen, inspectors, and rivals who would all later repeat the same line. A deadline was set and ignored. Inside that performance, someone else scripted violence. By night's end on that third day of the story, the working diagram looked like this. A grievance formalized on October 25th, follow-up meetings on October 26th and October 28th, a spoken 20-day window for repair, a morning arrival to inspect compliance, a staged explosion at the storage lean-to, a sprint to a small 20-square-meter room with a 12-inch slit, 8 shots through 3 viable lanes, 7 dead, 1 set of prints, 1 man. The task force was no longer asking whether there were 2 attackers. They were asking a narrower, harder question. Which insider did this? Whose hands could make circuits from sight power? And whose feet knew the shortest line between blast and rifle? Somewhere in the personnel lists and sign-out logs, in the ledgers that tracked emulsion sticks and detonators, in the schedule of who had what keys and when, a name waited. It would not be a name known in Beijing. It would be a name spoken in the lamp room and the canteen, a name that carried the dull respect given to men who keep the lights on and the fans humming. The investigation had left the world of big men, at least for a moment. It was about to enter the world of the men who wired their plans by habit. The case bent toward the inside. That was the feeling in the task force room. When they laid out the evidence again, wire cut from sight power, emulsion residue, a manual switch scorched at the hinge, a sprint from the lean to the small house, and a single set of prints threading both places together. If the plan felt intimate with the mine, then the planner likely was too. Explosives are tightly controlled, and only a handful of people can check them out. Fewer still can wire a circuit without tripping breakers, so investigators turned the lens on a narrow circle. Xiaotongdi's electricians and the managers who handled civilian blasting materials. One name rose from the list like a watermark in sun: Wang Feiyun. The choice did not come from hunch. Days before the blast, Wang Feiyun had signed out a batch of emulsion and detonators, but never logged the purpose or the return. Confronted, he did not dissemble. He admitted both acts. He had built the charges and he had fired the rifle into the fleeing crowd. He did it, he said, because he was the closest lieutenant of Wang Jianfu, and because everything he did for his big brother. That statement cracked open a second strand: fear and theater. According to Feiyun, Jianfu had no intention of repairing the damaged tunnel, despite a spoken pledge to finish within 20 days. Pressure from Zheng Shunyun made Jianfu feel hunted. He expected a convoy, a clash, sooner rather than later, so he geared up his life. He hired more than a dozen bodyguards. He bought body armor, helmets, and other protective equipment. He added weapons, hunting guns, makeshift pipe bombs, and a small caliber rifle kept within reach. When he traveled, there was always a gun and 2 homemade bombs in the car. Feiyun said the plan was simple. If Zheng rolled in with numbers, Jianfu's side would meet force with force and send him home with a scar he would not forget. That was the boss's plan. Feiyun had a tighter one. Too many guards, he argued, drew eyes. Protection on the road might help, but inside the mine, stealth mattered more than muscle. Let me hold the ground alone, he told Jianfu. Fewer men meant fewer mouths and fewer prints. For that promise, Jianfu cut him 2% of Xiaotongdi as payment and charged him formally with security. A week before the blast, November 9th, by Feiyun's account, he drew 4 packets of emulsion and 4 detonators from the store. He built the devices and planted them in the storage lean to near shaft 2, then climbed to the arch above the shaft and chiseled a fresh escape hole. He scouted a single-story workhouse set slightly higher than the yard. Despite rails and brake handles cluttering the view, he decided it would work. A hole hacked to about 12 inches would make a slit just wide enough for a muzzle and a sightline. Then he went shopping. He bought a small caliber rifle and 6 cartridges from a local named Wang Zibang for 3,600 yuan. Jianfu, who doubted 6 would be enough against hundreds, bought Feiyun 2 more boxes of rounds. Practice followed. Twice Fei Yun carried the rifle into the hills to shoot where no one would hear. Once he tested it on a steel door, in an abandoned yard behind the mine. The grouping clustered tight enough for confidence. The design did the rest. With the funnel-built blast, panic, 3 lanes of movement below exquisite marksmanship was less important than rhythm. He believed he could hold the slit and time his trigger to the beat of fear. Jian Fu sweetened the steak, finished the job, and 10% more of the mine would be his. Fei Yun told himself that even killing was a form of protection. November 18th, 2010 arrived like a clock striking. It was the last day of the repair window as the county told it. Jing came hard more than 30 vehicles, more than 120 men, split into groups pushing down the road to Xiaotongdi. When Fei Yun saw Zheng's people massing near Shaft 2, he triggered the charges from the arch. Then, stunned by the concussion, ran the path he had rehearsed to the little house and set the rifle in the slit. The crowd did what crowds do. Surged, checked, broke, funneled. He fired into that funnel. 7 people fell and did not rise. He would later say he did not aim fine, that the crowd was so dense and so wounded that the shots found bodies without care. After the shooting, the choreography turned bureaucratic. Wang Jianfu walked into a police station to surrender. The bodyguards were dismissed. Fei Yun hid the rifle. Investigators moved outward in circles and took down the periphery men who sold guns and ammunition off-book, men who ferried boxes without invoices, men whose names lived in the corners of ledgers. The mechanics of a crime make their own trail. On paper, 1118 could now be called solved. The bomb maker was the shooter. His hands knew the mine. His feet stitched blast to slit. His confession matched the physics. But police work does not end at a confession, especially not one that threads itself so neatly through a feud. The task force pivoted toward the man who had arrived that morning with buses and a grievance. Zheng Shunyun, counted publicly as a victim, had also turned himself in. The question for investigators was not only who fired, but who staged and who set the stage. Motivation matters because it maps the next act: retribution, payment, concealment, or control. What Fei Yun's confession clarified above all was the architecture of the crime. It was not a sniper's miracle so much as a miner's design. He used tools a mine knows: emulsion, wire, site current, a storage shed, a workroom, and added the one tool a mine should never hear in anger: a rifle. He chose the slit not for elegance, but for lanes. He chose the day because it intersected a public deadline and a private promise. He chose the number of devices to shape movement, rather than to maximize blast casualties. The method soothed because it was neat. The intent chilled because it was cold. And yet, in the room where detectives taped maps and wrote arrows, another set of choices demanded answers. Who promised additional shares 2% now, 10% later? What did those promises buy? Silence, loyalty, initiative, or a fall guy? Who bought the extra cartridges, and why? When the shooter fired only 8 times, did he need more? The answers would pull the probe back toward Wang Jianfu, not as a trigger man, but as a man who constructed a world in which this could happen. There is a particular cruelty to crimes designed around panic. They turn ordinary human instincts into liabilities. Fei Yun's confession made that cruelty explicit. He did not need to pick faces. He only needed to make people run where the bullet lanes were. Under law, that is murder. Under the mine's unwritten rules, some would try to call it a lesson. The task force, building out the chart of names and favors, would not allow that euphemism to stand. By now, the mine's routine noises had returned to conveyor thrumming, fans turning, voices in low talk, but the county was not fooled. Word traveled along the same roads Zheng's convoy had taken, now carrying a different cargo, details, names, and a new storyline in which the supposed victim might also be a protagonist. The ground had already given up the mechanics. The people would now have to give up the rest. The first impression of Zheng Xunyun in custody was not of a man broken by shock. It was of a man performing power. He walked into the provincial station scraped and sore, but in the holding area he talked loud, signed statements when he felt like it, and refused when he did not. Officers noted the posture because it did not match the script of a simple victim. Later, when investigators searched the convoy that had rolled in behind him that morning, they found what calm words try to hide: sticks, daggers, and the tools of a crowd that expected to do more than negotiate. That find reframed everything. Zheng had not simply come to inspect repairs. He had assembled more than 100 men from beyond Luoxi County's borders and driven them into Xiaotongdi in more than 30 vehicles. The mix was telling. Only a handful were local laborers. The rest had been pulled from other districts in Yunnan and brought here as muscle. In a mine belt where meetings can turn hard in a breath, the difference between a delegation and a raid is intent, and intent often rides in the trunks of cars. The task force pushed on the hardest question: how in so short a time could Zheng gather that many bodies and bind them to his purpose? The answer lay not at the shaft, but in the shadow economy that fed it. County investigators opened ledgers and listened to the rumors they had filed away for years. Zheng's holdings were spoken of in the rounded numbers of power: 7 coal mines, a coal washing plant, a 3-star hotel, a cold storage warehouse, and cash that ran into the hundreds of millions of yuan. But the sources of that wealth were not clean. The picture that formed was of a man who took, leveraged, and threatened until assets bent into his orbit. He had a record to match. In 2007, Zheng was convicted for gambling 2 years in prison, with a suspended term of 4, yet the syndicate continued, spreading through Kunming, Luoxi, and Kujing like veins under a mountain. Gambling dens flourished. Loans were extended with terms that bit. Profits came not only from the tables but from the debts that followed men home. The organization he built had a name: Lightning, and the swagger of one. Recruits included street toughs and ex-convicts. There were uniforms for show and rules for silence. New members wrote out a pledge 500 times: keep everything sealed. The meaning was clear if arrested: you carry your own weight and keep the group's secrets buried. Inside that code, loyalty was purchased and then performed. Zheng did not only pay salaries. He layered festivals and holidays with extra envelopes, a gesture that in Chinese communities marks both generosity and hierarchy. Core members were promised shares, given cars, and most striking offered apartments. In late 2008, Zheng bought 10 units in a Luoxi complex on 10-year terms and dangled them before his inner circle. Stay loyal for 10 years, and the keys are yours. It was a contract of time and dependence, the kind that binds a man's family to his boss's fortune. Violence, meanwhile, was both tactic and theater. When local mine supervisors came to check a Zheng site, enforcers made sure the visit ended with bruises and fear. Years earlier, in 2006, after one of Zheng's pits ran thin and butted up against a neighboring state-owned mine, he pushed his crews sideways anyhow. When challenged, he did what intimidation always threatens. He reached for the family, forcing the owner to back down. The county remembers such stories because they travel quickly, and they teach lessons about who may be crossed and who may not. Power also needs a stage. In Jima Town, within Luoxi County, a long wall ran like a scar for hundreds of meters, wrapping a gambling ground that Zheng had built. Inside were bleachers for spectators and a parking field. The whole compound ate more than 80 mu of land, roughly about 13 acres, with much of it pried from farmers at prices too low to fight. On certain days, the ring filled with the bellows of bull against bull fights, a rural spectacle where owners wager heavily and crowds roar. Very different from Western rodeos, but comparable in its ritual and risk. Zheng kept 40 to 50 fighting bulls, one valued near 200,000 yuan. On November 16th and 17th, those fights ran hot. On November 18th, Zheng drove toward Xiaotongdi. The line between entertainment and enforcement had rarely felt thinner. So when detectives now looked back at the mine yard, they no longer saw only one man's loss. They saw two rival sovereignties colliding: Wangjian, Fu's private domain at Xiaotongdi, and Zheng's traveling court. One of Wang's insiders, Wang Feiyun, had already admitted to building the charges and firing the rifle. That confession stitched wire to bullet and placed a single set of prints across both scenes. But it did not erase the presence of Zheng's convoy, the weapons in its cars, or the purpose they announced without words. The morning had become a referendum on reputation, and reputation here was measured in how loudly you arrived and how quietly others left. The choreography of that morning now looked sickeningly deliberate. The deadline for repairs spoken in offices, repeated in tea houses, sat like a mark on the calendar. A day before, Zheng's bulls had charged within walls he owned. The next day, his men stood at a rival's gate. Feiyun's blast flipped the switch from threat to blood. In the churn that followed, Zheng himself cut the air with an explanation, telling a coal trader named Liu that power lines had failed and people had been electrocuted, an account that would have recast the event as accident if it had been allowed to stand. But the bodies carried bullet wounds, and the wiring in the lean told a different truth. For the task force, the work now split. On one rail, they continued to fortify the case against Feiyun and chart the influence of Wang Jianfu, who hired whom, who bought which gun, who promised which slice of the mine in return for security. On the other rail, they widened the aperture around Zheng. If the morning had been meant as a demonstration, then the county needed to answer with one of its own. Within weeks, the province assigned more than 300 officers, including economic police, and began a methodical pull on every thread that tied back to lightning. The raids that followed were not showy. They were exhaustive. The gambling dens were mapped, the loan books were seized, associates in Kunming, Luoxi, and Kujing were rounded up. Early in 2011, arrests surged past 40. Cash and assets were frozen. What the mine had revealed a capacity for violence wrapped in business was now being audited line by line. When a county cleans house, the brooms are accounts and indictments. By November 1st, 2011, the case moved into the open. In the Intermediate People's Court in Honghe, Zheng Shunyun and his co-defendants stood under the High Red Seal, while prosecutors read out charges that reached beyond a single blast: organized crime, illegal gambling, loan sharking, assaults, and the conspiracy that had sent a convoy to a rival shaft. The courtroom was full in the way. Provincial courtrooms are when a name that used to travel in whispers is finally spoken at a microphone. However the verdicts would be written, one thing was already clear. The county had decided that the story of victim did not fit the man who could call 100 men in a day. Across all of this, the mine remained the dark center. Feiyun's confession still mattered. It described a plan built from a miner's knowledge and a guard's fear. Fetch emulsion from the store, wire a simple circuit to site power, carve an escape at the arch, select a small room with a crude 12-inch slit, and wait for the moment when panic would deliver bodies into 3 narrow lanes of fire. He said Wang Jianfu would reward him 2% of Xiaotongdi first, and after the job, 10% more. He said extra ammunition had been bought in expectation of a siege that never came. Whatever else Zheng had intended that morning, Feiyun turned intent into death. And yet the county's story needed closing, not only naming. It needed to tell those who lived under both men's shadows that the state could still redraw the map. That is why the prosecutors did not stop at Feiyun's clean admissions. They pressed on with the lightning file, and with the evidence stacked outside the mine, the sticks and knives, the apartment contracts, The bullpens, the uniform shirts, the pledge lines written 500 times by hands that now shook. A convoy had driven into Xiaotongdi on November 18th. By the following year, convoys of police drove out with boxes labeled evidence. In a world built on seams and trespass, on tunnels that slip under boundaries drawn in office ink, it is tempting to call everything a misunderstanding until it explodes. Part of the task force's duty was to strip away that comfort. The blast and the bullets were not accidents of proximity. They were decisions made by men who understood how fear moves crowds and how reputation moves men. One of those men, Wang Feiyun, spoke first and clearest. The other, Zhang Xunyun, had written his story with more than words, long before he stepped into a station and spoke loudly for the record. By the time the court recessed on that November day in 2011, Hu Qing's allies were already reciting a new version of events. It went like this. The mine's dead deserved names. The plan deserved the name of the man who wired it, and the convoy deserved the name of the man who called it. When stories finally align with the ground, justice begins to look less like theater and more like weight. The county had been waiting a long time for the weight to shift. In the end, the story of a mine had to pass through a courtroom. Months after the blast and the rifle fire, after raids and ledgers and interviews that folded the county back on itself, the last act moved under the Red Seal, where benches were hard, microphones rang with echo, and sentences were measured out like stone. The names that Hu Qing whispered now stood in full light. Paper replaced rumor. The state took the stage that others had tried to build. The decisions landed in two waves, half a calendar apart and heavy with meaning. On May 12, 2012, the court set down the hardest of lines for the two men at the center of the mine's blood. Wang Jianfu, the mine boss whose insider had wired the circuit, and Wang Feiyun, the insider himself who had both built the charges and fired the rifle. They were convicted of intentional homicide and of trafficking and storing weapons and explosives without authorization. The penalty in each case was death. They appealed. The Yunnan High People's Court rejected those appeals and kept the original verdicts exactly as they were. One more signature remained. And in China, that signature belongs to the Supreme People's Court in Beijing. When the High Court reviewed the files, it approved the death sentences. The judicial line was now unbroken, from county to province to capital. A year later, the court wrote the name Zhang Junyun beside a different kind of finality. On May 13, 2013, he received a death sentence with a 2-year reprieve for 12 separate crimes: robbery, disturbing public order, organizing crowds to fight, illegal coal mining, intentional injury, obstructing officials, extortion, running gambling operations, disrupting business, coercive trading, and the seizure of farmers' land. In Chinese practice, a death with 2-year reprieve means the execution is suspended for 2 years. If the prisoner commits no intentional crimes and reforms well during that period, the sentence is typically commuted to life imprisonment. For a man who had performed power in public for years, the legal theater ended with a clock and a leash. The blast had killed 9 and wounded 48. The legal aftershock reached far wider. In total, 87 people were prosecuted in connection with the case. The county and province also signaled that power runs in both directions. 20 local officials were disciplined for their roles: acts of omission, acts of looking away, acts of convenience dressed as caution. The mine was never only a private kingdom. It sat inside a larger map, and that map had rules the center still expected to be obeyed. If you stand at the edge of that courtroom picture long enough, the story resolves into a pattern of stacked impunity. Years before, Wang Jianfu had drifted across a boundary beneath Diutin because the old owner was malleable. Then ownership changed hands, and the man on the other side of the line was Zhang Xunyun, who would not be malleable at all. Zheng demanded accounting and payment and repair. Wang blew a plug across the illicit tunnel and called it closure. The county offices brokered meetings. A 20-day promise about repairs was spoken aloud and nodded at soft law in a hard place. When that soft law met two men bent on performance, the end was almost foregone. A convoy at dawn, a blast at the lean-to, a slit in a wall, 7 bodies felled by rifle fire, and a county stunned into clarity. The court's long list of convictions and approvals did not erase the morning, but it moved the story from myth and threat back into statute and consequence. Zheng's file became its own landscape in the months between verdicts. When police opened the books and followed the money, they found an organization that had fused business with fear, gambling, loan sharking, security, acquisition by pressure, dressed as negotiation. People in town had long described him with the rounded numbers of power, but the transcripts caught the texture. This was not only a gang boss in the narrow sense, it was a local sovereign in places where the central gaze was intermittent, a figure who borrowed from ritual and economy alike to keep a following fed and loyal. That is why the court did not stop at a single label. It listed crime after crime until a portrait appeared of a man who had written rules for himself and asked a county to live by them. One of the difficult truths in cases like this is that violence is almost never an accident of proximity. It is an equation of pride, debt, and certainty. The investigation had already shown how Wang Feiyun converted that equation into architecture. 4 charges planted to shape movement, a rough hole hacked to about 12 inches to make a firing slit, 3 lanes of sight formed by ore carts and brake hardware, 8 shots timed to panic, 7 dead. What the sentencing phase clarified was the human calculus behind each node of that design. A boss who feared humiliation and purchased security in shares and promises. A rival who believed that numbers more than 100 men in more than 30 vehicles could overawe a mine into submission. A county where some officials decided that stepping aside was easier than stepping in. The court's 87 prosecuted and 20 disciplined put numbers spelled out, not shrugged on a culture of looking away. There is a temptation, standing after the fact, to call Zheng's convoy simply a mistake of timing. The bulls fought inside his wall on the 16th and 17th. The men massed at a rival's gate on the 18th. If not for the explosives and the rifle, perhaps the day would have ended in shoves and curses. That is the comfort that courtrooms are built to reject. The record shows intent shaped through weeks, meetings on October 26th and October 28th, demands for accounting within 20 days, a deadline spoken in offices and repeated over tea. It also shows preparation on the other side. Emulsion and detonators signed out, a slit chiseled, a rifle purchased and tested, a route rehearsed from arch to firing room. When cause meets preparation, result is not accident. By the time verdicts were read, the phrase mine accident had been ripped out of the county's vocabulary and replaced with the plain criminal names the penal code demands. It is also tempting to tell the story as a clean moral triangle. A bully meets a bigger bully. The bigger bully meets the state. The truth is messier and more useful. Wang Jianfu learned that hiring muscle and promising shares does not domesticate violence. It invites it. Zheng Xunyun learned that convoys and reputations collapse in a room where judges read articles instead of rumors. The county learned that neutrality from officials is not neutral at all. It is permission, and permission grows teeth. And the miners, the men whose boots carried black dust home each night, learned again the oldest lesson of heavy industry. The real risk is not only in the scene, it is in the hands that think they own it. In Chinese legal practice, a death sentence with a 2-year reprieve is a particular instrument. It says that the state can, in theory, end a life immediately, but chooses a leash instead, a long, public proving ground that often ends in life imprisonment if the prisoner reforms. That choice fit Zheng because his career was a long public act. The measured punishment matched the measured performance, and it told every small town in Yunnan the same thing. The state will give you time to stop being what you built. It will not give you permission to keep being it. Numbers travel well in places that speak in stories. 9 dead, 48 injured, 87 prosecuted, 20 officials disciplined, 12 charges for Zheng, 2 death penalties, approved at the highest level. The mine, once a private quarrel that ran under other people's land, had been pulled back above ground and measured in phrases that fit into law. It is cold comfort, but it is the kind that lets a county find sleep again. The mountain quiet returns differently after you have heard what it can hide. And yet, the documentary rhythm of a life does not end with a sentence. In Hucheng's alleys, people still recite, "The dead deserve names. The plan deserves the name of the man who wired it. The convoy deserves the name of the man who called it." That is how stories align with ground. That is how theater becomes weight. On May 13th, 2013, when the last of the major verdicts was written, you could feel that shift to the sense that for the first time since the blast, the county's balance was no longer in the hands of men with cars, but in the hands of a clerk who writes what lasts.